Hello and welcome to this meeting on Grenfell housing and racism. We're really pleased that you can join us, and we hope you'll make yourself known and tell us where you're from in the chat, in the comments. All the panel speakers can see and read the comments, so do keep the questions flowing, and please don't wait till the end, because that's what always happens. We're really glad you can join us for this meeting, which is a very serious panel trying to look at a very toxic issue. My name's Eileen Short. I'm part of the Homes for All UK Alliance of tenants groups, housing campaigners and trade unions who are trying to fight off attacks on our homes and our rights, and to win rent control and a new generation of public housing. We've got a great panel, so can I just suggest that if you're just logging in, can you remind or invite others who might not want to miss it to come and join us, and get your comments in. Get your comments in fast, and your questions. So we've got a really good spread of speakers who are going to tackle some of the burning questions of the moment. If you're Black, Asian, or from another ethnic minority in Britain, and I know this is true in other parts of the world too, currently you are at least twice as likely to die from COVID. And in fact, for some groups like Bengali men, I think the figure is you're 4 times as likely to die. But you're also more likely to be homeless, you're more likely to live in unsafe conditions, you're more likely to be overcrowded and insecure in your housing. And we know that there's a whole inglorious history of housing as a kind of delivery mechanism for racism in communities and societies. So we're hoping to have a look at that. But we're meeting on this day because 3 years and a month ago, the terrible fire at Grenfell killed 72 people, and it also devastated the lives of the survivors and the bereaved, but also of a whole community. And there's serious questions about why that fire happened, why the people who in that community are still not all rehoused, why no justice has been achieved, nobody has yet been held to account for that fire, and 2,000 other blocks still have similar dangerous cladding. So to just introduce the discussion, we're gonna have a moment of reflection just to remember the dead of Grenfell, and then we're going to welcome David O'Connell and Abbas who are respectively Vice Chair and Chair of the Lancaster West Residents Association, which includes and included Grenfell Tower. So we'll just take a moment and then we'll welcome David and then Abbas. Okay, David.
Hi, I'm David from Lancaster West, which is the estate where the tower stood, and what's left of the tower still stands. It's had a devastating effect here on all of us. I mean, because watching friends and neighbours perish in front of you has had a truly, I mean, the damage it caused to the community and to people's lives is still reverberating now. That people's lives are still being spun off track. Still, people are still looking to be housed properly. So there's a lot of issues. The tower is like a symbol of everything that's gone wrong with housing and with social housing in this country for the last 30 years or more. And I think a lot of it goes back to the way people are treated and the people look at social housing. They look at it as it's gone from being good homes for people to live in to being some sort of dumping ground for people who just can't cope. And I think a lot of that has led to people not having opportunities, you know, because all of my friends and neighbours here, I can't think of a greater bunch of people that live on this estate, and the way they pulled together after the fire was truly inspiring. And the things people did, the things that people achieved, and it's because they just felt a sense of commonality and they wanted to pull together. But that stands in stark contrast to the way the authorities treated us. And the feeling we get all the time would be that we'd be fobbed off with something, they promised something, they want to change things, and they would never fulfill those promises. They never deliver on what they promised. And I think a lot of that has been what has led us to this point where they could clad a block in totally flammable cladding and not really care about how it was put on, not really care about how cheaply and shoddily it was done, and not listen to those people when they told them that the building we're living in isn't safe, that there's been all these problems with the building. And the fire was the inevitable outcome of that. And it has destroyed so many lives around here, and not just the lives of the people who sadly perished, but the lives of people who've lost loved ones, people who still are depressed, can't work. And none of that has really been answered adequately because the system that did that in the first place isn't equipped or even thinks about helping people and how, or even has the ability to fix what has gone wrong. So I think race plays a large part in that, and I think there's a big element of why do people from ethnic minorities in this country have so few opportunities, and why do they fall into poorer and less advantaged groups? You know, because what social housing should provide is a place for people to live in secure, solid homes where they can build a life for themselves here and achieve the things that, I mean, because it doesn't matter what colour you are or what class or race you are, it's what you have inside you is that something you can give. And I think that people, one of the big problems we've had is that people don't have opportunities on places like this. They've never had an opportunity to move anywhere or to achieve anything.
Yeah, I think fundamental issue is that government, they don't see people equal. So a lot of people, like David said, they are dumped in the worst standard properties, and you have to live with that because you have no other option. So if you want to say, no, I don't want this property, it doesn't meet any habitable standards, they say, this is it. We don't have a duty of care towards you. You have an option to accept it or refuse it and become homeless and live on the street. And then what happens the next stage is they don't spend any investment on your property until it is run down and they do their regeneration because the land is very expensive here. So they can sell it off to these big corporate companies and make more money and send these sort of residents outside London or wherever they go, they don't care. So they need to decide, you know, people are equal and they have a duty of care towards them. At the end of the day, it is people's money they are spending and they're supposed to serve those people. But unfortunately, that's not the case.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Well, it's grim, but it's true. I'm not sure that Chivona is still on the call. So we'll hopefully go back to her. Oh, Chivona welcome, and we're very pleased to have Chivona Newsome with us. She is one of the founders of the Greater New York Black Lives Matter. Sorry, we made a mistake with calling it New York City. We're all really inspired by the fire that's been lit by Black Lives Matter, and we're really keen to hear what you have to say about housing racism and the situation, the fight that you're fighting.
Thank you so much for having me. And housing is absolutely racist. It's all designed in systemic oppression where Black people are allowed to live, where they're allowed to raise their family. Your zip code determines where you go in life. Unfortunately, so we need to think about all the other ways that people who look like me are oppressed. So that's what the mission has been with Black Lives Matter Greater New York. We follow the 10-point plan of the Black Panther Party, and having good shelter and an adequate place to live, it was one of those key points. So we fought as an organization with our allies to pass the New York State Tenant Protection Act. And what that act did was it made the strongest laws for tenants in the whole country. So having good cause eviction, opening up housing to people so you wouldn't end up on the street. But we need to do more. Right now, the United States government has denied adequate housing to a vast majority of people. Our HUD department has not released funds. We know that as of right now in New York State alone, where our organization is, we need multiple units of housing, an investment of $12 million. So that's what we're fighting for. We're fighting for the full economic and justice of Black people. And it's in a variety of ways. And we released something called the Black Act. And in that act, it's making a demand for education. It's making a demand for housing, so we can greenline our community as it once was redlined, and further the advancement of Black people in America and hopefully global.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm hoping, as you can see, Apsana's on the move. Chivona's on the move.
Yes, I am. I'm on the way to the airport right now.
Yeah, and I'm hoping you can stay with us for a little while, and maybe get a chance to hear some questions. But if not, we might just bring you back.
I would love to. I would definitely love to come back, and I'll stay on as long as possible.
Yeah, grand. So we will come back to you if we get a chance, but you can say a bit before you go, hopefully. So next, our next panel member is a housing activist and a resident in North Kent and a Grenfell resident, Moyra Samuels, who's known to the housing movement, certainly in London. But today she's speaking on behalf of Stand Up to Racism. And I should say that partly why that our campaign, Homes for All, has agreed more than once that to be a housing campaigner, we need to be an anti-racist campaign, because if you're not, the danger is that you facilitate the culture of blame and lies and racism that goes with housing in this country. So from our point of view, partly why we're having this meeting is that we need to build a strong, solid, anti-racist housing movement from top to bottom in order to challenge the endemic racism and to hear our brothers and sisters when they tell us what's happening. So on that note, I'm really pleased and proud that we can introduce Moyra on behalf of Stand Up to Racism.
Thank you, Eileen. Just to correct something Eileen said. I live 300 meters from the tower, and I've lived in the area for over 30 years. And like so many people in the community, I, watched that horrific fire on the night. And it's quite right that David says that it's actually impacted on the community. It's a wound that actually we say will take a generation to heal. So with regard to the role of racism, and especially institutional discrimination and what led to Grenfell, I think as a community, we became aware of the role of racism quite slowly in the weeks following the fire. And for many of us, as we were responding to people's needs following the fire, it became that elephant in the room. The elephant in the room that the barrister, Leslie Thomas, who's representing some of the core participants, bereaved and survivors at the public inquiry, said, he said racism, institutional racism, is the elephant in the room. And as a community, we attributed what happened at Grenfell to class. That was our immediate instinct, was that actually this was because we had a local authority who treated the community of North Kensington with institutional indifference. It's not that they hated us, they just did not care what happened to us. And we'd experienced, years of gentrification, I think as Abbas and David had referred to, the same gentrification that was happening right across working class estates in London and in other parts of the country. So the question of racism actually came to us quite slowly. And it came to us slowly almost after Theresa May, the then Prime Minister, came to visit the area and was almost drummed out. We then reflected, on the fact that the youth identified and called her a pagan, which apparently means a liar. We reflected on the fact that when she was Home Secretary, she probably was one of the most racist Home Secretaries this country has seen. She introduced the 2014 Immigration Act, which introduced a hostile environment for immigrants, leading to what is now known as the Windrush scandal, where Afro-Caribbean people who've lived here most of their life have been forced to actually lose their jobs because apparently they don't have valid documentation to prove that they have a right to live in this country. They lose their jobs, they've lost their right to housing, and they've lost their right to health care. This is also a Prime Minister who actually allowed, not far from us, vans to go about. They were called the go home vans, which said that actually if you're an illegal immigrant, you'd better go home or you were going to be arrested. And we knew the role of racism quite early on when the public inquiry was called into the fire, when people asked, bereaved families, survivors asked for institutional racism to be included in the terms of reference of that inquiry, when we asked that actually housing be included, social housing and the role of social housing be included, that was refused by the Prime Minister. Furthermore, when the names of those who perished so needlessly in that fire were released, we looked at those names and we realized that actually between 62 and 65 of those 72 people came from Black and minority ethnic communities. And exactly the points that people have raised again and again, is this the reason why they were not listened to when they raised questions of safety, when they chose a cladding for the tower block that they lived in, that that was ignored. They chose a cladding which was not flammable, but that was refused on the grounds that it cost too much. We also, I think many of us became aware and some of us were aware already, of the fact that actually Black and minority ethnic communities in this country, unlike what people sometimes suggest, don't get the best housing. They don't take, they don't get first access to housing, as some people, white people, claim. They actually wait longer on waiting lists. They get worse housing. They often actually housed in flats rather than homes. And we can see from Grenfell, 22 people with disabilities was housed above the 10th floor, which means they couldn't get access, couldn't actually, because their mobility issues, couldn't actually self-evacuate. So I think, the brutal killing of George Floyd at the end of May, 2 weeks, 2.5, 3 weeks before the 3rd anniversary, was such a stark reminder for this community of not just the brutality of the judicial system that Black people face in this country as well as in America, but actually those haunting words of "I can't breathe" actually had a real resonance with this community. And it in the uprisings that followed, those amazing uprisings, inspiring uprisings, saying enough is enough, this community went back, and the bereaved and survivors are going back to that public inquiry and demanding that the terms of reference include investigation of the role of institutional racism and why those residents were not listened to, or why they were treated so differently from south of the borough, which includes Chelsea and very well-off people. We've also got to remember that Grenfell, perhaps Abbas and David will talk about this. Grenfell, actually, the flats were very beautiful. They were very spacious. There were also leaseholders in that block. And the impact of that fire revealed the fact that actually, because of deregulation, because of profit, putting profit before people's lives, that it's not just this community that's been impacted. There are communities right across the country that have been impacted by that revelation. The fact that there are residents in quarantine, in lockdown, living in buildings with dangerous cladding, and the impact on their mental health is, must be extraordinary. So I think if we're going to fight against the implications of racism for Black people within housing, if we're going to fight for justice for Grenfell, I think we need to think of the implications of that for the whole country. It is not possible for one community to fight to get justice, to get change for such a huge scandal, and a criminal act that has happened to communities right across the country. We need a united campaign. We need a campaign that actually brings together leaseholders, that brings together private renters, that brings together people in council housing, so that actually we acknowledge and recognize the discrimination and fight against the discrimination that Black and minority ethnic people face in housing. And we come together and all demand the right for decent and safe housing. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Moyra. Okay, it's gone very echoey. Can we next, I'm really pleased to welcome Apsana Begum MP, who is not only a new MP who can put her finger on some of these issues, but also is the MP who represents the area of the West Ferry, the notorious West Ferry development, where our housing minister went out for dinner with the developer the night before and looked at the presentation on his phone but never talked about it. I'm sure Apsana can tell us more about that and about the impact, more seriously, of racism on the community that she represents, and hopefully, some ideas about what we are going to do about it. So Apsana, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Eileen, and thank you so much for having me on what is a very informative event. And I'm really feel quite honoured to actually share the platform also with really brilliant contributors from across the country and also in the United States as well. So thank you so much for having me. I mean, I will sort of start by, I guess, talking about Grenfell and you know how when you look at what happened there and what happened afterwards, the fact that so many people are still displaced for something that is of no fault of their own, and how I guess racist attitudes have tried to shape what happens to them and how they're able to then move forward, and also, you know, obtain safety, security, which is what housing is ultimately about, really. And Moyra mentioned, you know, the fact that these were quite nice flats. People, you know, this was a community that's been uprooted, and are still yet to face and yet still to obtain justice. And whilst all of this is going on, we have many other cases and many other situations of a similar nature that preceded Grenfell and follow Grenfell in many ways as well. And what happens to those who have completely been displaced and completely been uprooted from the very communities in which they found safety and security. And I raise this because I remember even in the few months following Grenfell, that unfortunately it was, you know, many elements of the mainstream media that really focused in on people who, you know, a small few people who took advantage of a difficult situation and may have committed crimes. And, you know, you had these big splashes of headlines around, you know, people who had made money and you know, exploited people who were stuck in a situation. And of course, that's wrong and that should be acknowledged. But it seems to be that the coverage of criminality, you know, far outweighed the coverage of people's experiences of actually losing their homes, losing their safety and their security. And I think it's important to recognize the way in which you know, the racism manifested itself in that situation. And there was also elements about people who may be undocumented that lived at Grenfell, and, you know, immigration as a whole, and how, you know, the various diverse communities themselves, you know, were living in an area which was quite segregated in comparison to other parts of the constituency, as we know. And I think, you know, that was a microcosm in some ways of what's, you know, what has been happening over decades in terms of housing policy and the way in which you know, communities have been housed in different areas. And the reason why I raise this is because I can think of examples even in East London and even in my constituency where, you know, even the demand for housing and the supply to meet that demand has meant that the racial segregation that is experienced by people who then get housed means that working class communities in particular are pitted against one another. And so even from my own experience, I can, you know, name the estates which were much more BAME than others. And, you know, that territorialism that was created out of that segregation in policies manifested itself and was not very good in terms of you know, working together and trying to fight for better homes and better housing. And instead of, I guess, focusing in on actually addressing the inequalities and addressing things like racism, actually it was perpetuated and developed and increased more through policies which racially segregated communities through housing itself. And I was reflecting just today about, you know, what I've spent, I guess, in some ways, a lot of the last week concentrating on, which is actually, you know, there's been a number of people in my constituency, for example, that have been now displaced. So it's about 100 people who, as a result of the what is being called an industrial accident, which was the crane collapse in Bow, has resulted in about 100 people being displaced and being put up in hotels, which is where they are currently. And sadly, one constituent of mine, June Harvey, sadly passed away. I was just reading an article about her just an hour ago about the fact that she was a seamstress. She was born in Poplar. She grew up here. She was a gardener and had lots of knowledge about flowers and plants. And sadly, she's lost her life, and there is now a criminal investigation underway. And a small community there on that estate who are now grappling with the situation of not being able to have access to their belongings, potentially not really knowing if they'll be able to return back. And so in some ways, I can't help but, although the two cannot be really compared in a lot of ways, but the commonality that this has in terms of the situation at Grenfell is that these people have been uprooted and, I guess, displaced, and we don't know yet for how long. And even the conversations that you have with constituents, or that I'm having with constituents, also reflect things that are still yet to be addressed in our housing system, from addressing concerns and addressing the needs of communities from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds, from looking at what's culturally appropriate for one community which is different from another community, and we're still, I guess, needing to make progress in this area. Another thing I wanted to sort of, I guess, cover was the fact that, I guess, in terms of the poor quality of housing that so many people live in, and how that actually relates to how that is actually a public health issue. And we talk about what we are faced with right now. We are still in a pandemic. We know about the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on BAME communities. We knew that in a lot of ways the situation around the overcrowded homes was going to exacerbate and make the risks for these communities greater. But it isn't a new fact, and it isn't something that's just come about now. A lot of us have been talking about this for a long time. We know that those that live in social housing, some of those that rent privately now, and those that live in private rented accommodation, for example, about a third of those, fail to meet the decent home standard because they don't have acceptable, bathroom or kitchen facilities or heating. Those with young children living in damp accommodation, are at higher risk of COVID-19, of course, because that's something that's been talked about as being, a risk factor. So these are the various kind of, I guess, issues that come to light as a result of COVID as well. And I couldn't help but also think about the fact that, we, in terms of understanding why all this matters and trying to analyze and understand it, I think we should actually in some ways look at the Moment Review, which looked at poverty in Britain, and really established that link between unsuitable and unstable housing, linking that to lower economic status, which is also linked to poor physical and mental health. And that vicious cycle of poorer life chances and lower life expectancy should be recognized. And that's why we're all here, I guess, in some ways today, because we recognize that all of these things, racism in housing and discrimination in housing, actually lowers life expectancy. So I think in terms of, Eileen, you mentioned about Westray Printworks. That's why something like that is of huge significance, because this is, this has meant money that could have come to a borough like Tower Hamlets, not coming here. And the image of just, having ministers and parliamentarians, sitting on, at an expensive dinner club, which, by the way, donates money to the Conservative Party as well, sitting there and deciding things and deciding the fate of so many people who otherwise could have gained something in terms of their infrastructure, in terms of housing, which they were deprived of. And that's, it's understandable to see the anger that people feel as a result of decisions which do not take into account and stereotype and label communities, where housing is such a big need. I did want to also mention, I guess, I think in terms of, the housing sector, so, there's been lots of initiatives about diversifying the housing sector, the senior leadership of the housing sector. I know there's targets around 2025 and whether we're going to meet them or not. And there's a lot of discussion, I guess, that has been happening in the in the housing sector overall about how to really meet the needs of BAME people. And I wonder if how much of that is really talking about how do you define racial discrimination in housing? How do you, how are issues of racial harassment being dealt with in housing? And I say this because, I was dealing with a case recently about racial harassment, and it was very difficult for a constituent to kind of record and relay and explain how, their experiences they didn't actually recognize was actually racially motivated, but my staff in my office could actually work out that actually there was a very significant racial element in their experience of housing, and being a tenant in social housing. So I think those are the conversations that really need to be had right now in the housing sector. There has been a lot that has happened, but I think it really needs to be pinned down in terms of racism, racial discrimination. How does that manifest itself in housing, and what solid things are going to be done to address that? There used to be, I could go on for ages, but there used to be, there was in the 80s lots of BME housing associations. Some of them kind of got swallowed up by mainstream housing associations. I think that's regrettable. I think what those organizations were able to provide, even though they're very small, was specialist. They were specialist in terms of their own communities, and I think that's dissolved a bit in the housing sector over the years. And those are some of the things that could be addressed. But they talk about this in terms of racism, in terms of housing stress, and what stresses there are and how that is higher and lower in different contexts. And I think we have to also relate it to where we stand now in terms of homelessness, in terms of what is really being brought to light as a result of this pandemic, which is that people are being moved, displaced, and being left homeless. And the government took measures where they said that people will be housed and people will not be left on the street in this pandemic. They were able to do that in this pandemic. If they're able to do that in a pandemic, why can they not do that on a permanent basis? And I have written to the government on that particular point, because I'm very concerned, I think, in terms of housing, especially in terms of homelessness, especially in terms of those with no recourse to public funds. I mean, the sheer ignorance of ministers, the Prime Minister, and not even recognising their own policies, and the hostile environment that actually exists in housing is unacceptable. It understandably makes so many people angry. And I think that's, there are so many issues to really focus in on. But I think, homelessness, rough sleeping, where we can, it's so visible as well to see that this is people from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds that are on the streets. Why are they on the streets? Why are we really not also addressing the issues of mental health, where tenants are being, evicted, and treated as criminals, essentially, in what are very difficult situations when it comes to mental health and housing, but essentially either left out on the streets or discriminated against further, as a result of perhaps what has been an accumulation of very, very poor experiences that has led to particular situations. And I think that's also an area that really, really needs focus, and that's what I'm going to be concentrating on as well going forward, because I think that that's something that's not fully recognised in terms of housing, and I think it's exacerbating a lot more racial inequality in our country. I'll finish there, Eileen.
Thank you very much, Apsana. I know you may need to leave. There was one question which I think you've probably already answered, but a question directly for you about whether you think there's a racist dimension to the Genric scandal. But I think perhaps if you have to go, then we can follow up on that.
Yeah, maybe I can answer it quickly. When we talk about discrimination, we talk about direct and indirect discrimination. So, with the correspondence that's been released and what we've seen, what we can definitely see is a complete disdain for the communities here. And the way in which the communities here have been overlooked is sort of like, oh, this is Tower Hamlets, or this is East London. You just go on with what we need to do. And I think it also highlights, I guess, the fact that the way in which this situation has been treated is favouring, obviously, and looking at the way in which relationships exist with millionaires and billionaires of the very poor that live in this constituency. So do I think there is, I would certainly say this development itself, and the fact that the affordable housing is so low, and we know that it needs to be much higher because it needs to address, the inequalities here. You can make some link as to the fact that, the communities here are looked at very poorly and very much looked at in ways which are not positive. And there was mention of the word rotten and all of these things in the chamber during a debate on that. And I think some of those words and some of those descriptions are actually very racially charged and point to racist tropes.
Thank you. We really appreciate you being able to join us. Okay, and actually that is a very good point at which to introduce our final speaker, who is Tanya Southwark. She's speaking on behalf of Defend Council Housing and is involved in a very fiery, let's say, campaign around the Elephant and Castle, which Tanya will explain. Okay, over to you, Tanya.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm the chair of Southwark Defend Council Housing. We have been around since 1999, when we were set up to stop the stock transfer of 56,000 council homes, which we succeeded in doing. And we've been fighting demolitions of council housing, and most recently I've been one of the coordinators of the Up the Elephant campaign, which is about preventing the state-led gentrification of the Elephant and Castle. I haven't got long, so I'm just going to do three headlines, three examples of how I think racism plays out in my borough in the allocation of housing and property in Southwark. So 71% of all homeless applications are from Black and minority ethnic people. The majority of those living in temporary, overcrowded, unsuitable accommodation are BAME, but the council has been destroying council housing faster than it's building it. So there are fewer and fewer homes for those people to live in. Second thing, the so-called regeneration of the Aylesbury estate, 2,400 council homes. It will effectively wipe out a mostly Black and minority ethnic community. The infringement of their human rights was acknowledged by the inspector for a compulsory purchase order in 2016. Despite that acknowledgement, the demolition continues. And thirdly, the Up the Elephant campaign, the mostly Latin and BAME independent traders at the Elephant and Castle shopping centre face removal with little or no compensation. We've been fighting for more than 3 years. They've got more than they did at the beginning, but it's still not enough. More than 50 of them currently still have nowhere else to go once they're removed. So the second biggest Latin hub in London is about to be erased. I would argue that probably none of this has been done by politicians who are openly racist. None of the development companies, none of the housing associations, the educational institutions, the public bodies involved in these processes would say that these outcomes that I've just described were planned for or are even desirable. Maybe some of them might even describe themselves as anti-racist. but no amount of unconscious bias training or supportive hashtags can hide the fact that these institutions are pursuing policies that have racist outcomes. So what is it about the normal way of doing housing that produces these racist outcomes? I would suggest it's an acceptance of the logic of capitalism within housing, leading to the kind of institutional indifference that Moyra talked about earlier. It means that the needs of working class people, particularly black and brown people, come second when landlords, developers and privatised institutions must make a profit. And the institutions that support that within government, central government and so on, they may not be privatised, but they're part of a state where the logic of supporting profits is the key driver of their activities. In Southwark, we've been running a campaign called Requisition Empty Homes. Take the homes from the private sector, turn them into council homes. And we've also said that all empty council homes should be filled. Now, on the Aylesbury estate, they've been decanting residents and taking them out in readiness for demolition. So on our third protest on Saturday, that will be a protester on the Aylesbury estate. It's a case in point. There were 2,400 council homes. Now the so-called regeneration has moved on, and the council is going to be providing 581 council homes to replace the 2,400 to be lost. This is an improvement. It started off as 0 council homes, so it's definitely improvement. That's a gain for our campaign. But as with all of these things, it's a bit more complicated. The council's actually bailing out the developer. That's Notting Hill Genesis, an alleged housing association. Each additional council home will cost the council more than £600,000. At the same time, they haven't stopped forcing tenants and residents off the estate and breaking up the working class community. It's been calculated that they could have refurbished the entire estate of 2,400 council homes for roughly the same amount of money that they have spent, and who knows what extra they're going to spend. They're only on phase 1, by the way. This is the kind of thing that happens when you don't challenge the system, when you play by the rules. So I'd like to say finally what needs to happen. We should take a different approach. We have to stop the encroachment of developers into our communities and public spaces. We have to demand that empty homes are taken over and turned into council housing. We have to break the power of landlords, and we have to resist evictions. We really have to make Black Lives Matter, really, not just say it, but actually do it. In order to do that, we have to confront the power of capital and build a movement that does not play by their rules.
Thank you, Tanya. Thanks very much, and thanks. There's now nearly 70 people listening across the 2 live streams, and everybody's very welcome. And your questions are very welcome. So we've got one round of questions I'm going to put to our speakers, and then we're going to move on to try and come to some practical outcomes about what action we can take to take a step forward in linking up the fight against racism and the fight for housing rights for Black and Asian and minority ethnic people and everybody else that needs a home. But first, I'd like to put a question that's specifically to David, Abbas and Moyra. What do you think are the chances of the inquiry bringing justice for Grenfell? I'm going to read out a couple of other questions, give them a bit of time to think. A question from Paul in Haringey. What can we do to stop tenure segregation and what we call poor doors, separate entrances for council and housing association tenants, keeping us away from the rest? I think Chivona's probably not on the call anymore, but there is a question for her from Richie about how Black Lives Matter strike of the 20th of the 7th is building. But can I first go back to David, Abbas and Moyra on the inquiry? If you can keep it short and sharp. And Apsana, obviously, if you want to comment on any of this, do.
Yes. If I go first, I need to add, I think Grenfell tragedy has exposed how broken the social housing system is, but unfortunately we didn't see any improvement from government to change the way they treat us and other people in the same situation. To be honest, I don't think that justice will be delivered, especially with the inquiry. I don't see much of this, and the immunity they have now is really disappointing the way it goes. If I had a choice, I would go for persecution. David?
I mean, I agree. I think it's been very disappointing the way the inquiry's come back. I understand the restrictions of COVID, but there was a request that there be a limited amount of people allowed to attend. And I think removing the bereaved and relatives from the inquiry process removes the reality of what it's about, which is about people losing their lives and people losing their loved ones. So I think that's really been a bit of a blow to the inquiry. Again, why we're having the inquiry before the criminal prosecutions, I don't know. I mean, that's the way it's normally done. They prosecute people for the criminal acts first and then have an inquiry into what went wrong with the systems afterwards.
Thank you.
Moyra?
Oh, Abbas,
Yes.
go on.
Shall I speak?
Yeah, go on.
I think that the fact that Theresa May called an inquiry 3 weeks after the fire actually was a real indication of the way I think the ruling class, those in authority, often deal with stuff like that. We've seen the levels of inquiries we've had in this country. And I think what I think, and I hope I don't speak out of turn for bereaved and survivors, is that what they wanted was truth. Why did their relatives die? And also, we all, the whole community, believes that actually people who made those decisions need to be held accountable and they need to be prosecuted. And what we've seen in the inquiry, with all the delaying tactics and all the decision making that seems to be in the favor of the corporates, the people with cladding, the insulators, or the Ryden, etc., that actually the inquiry is geared towards protecting those people. And so we might, with the immunity from prosecution being granted to them, we might have some truth, but we're certainly doubtful as to whether we'll have accountability and therefore prosecutions. Because the inquiry, anyway, by the time it finishes, will be 2022, and then the criminal investigation will only start after that. So it'll be probably about 6 years later. So yes, I think we want to get justice or accountability. I think we're going to have to demand it ourselves by any means necessary.
Apsana, Tanya, do you want to add anything on that, or should we move along? Abbas, did you want to come back? Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I just wanted to emphasize, to be honest, probably that explains, again, the racism playing part in this. If it was different sort of people, probably we would have the criminal investigation instantly taking place. But probably some lives don't matter as much. Over to you.
Okay. Unless anybody wants to pick that up, I'm going to go on to the question of tenure segregation, which Apsana mentioned, how, you know, we know this still goes on. 30 years ago, when I was bringing up my kids, it took action going to the Commission for Racial Equality to expose Tower Hamlets Council keeping the block I was in as an all-white block. I mean, it's not all white anymore, but and Tower Hamlets councillors were paying fines rather than housing homeless families in their bit of the borough. And I think what this meeting is demonstrating is that sometimes it's good when we can stop those things happening and when we can call it by its name. But what's also true is that there's a insidious tide of racism, which means that even when they don't call it that anymore, the process still goes on, and we still have segregated estates, and we still have an enormous increase in the last 20 years. The number of homeless people from Black and Asian minority ethnic groups has gone up from 18% to 36%, a huge increase, and completely disproportionate to the population, because that's where the hit is falling. But anyway, sorry, tenure segregation. Tanya, Apsana, or others?
And just to mention very quickly, I mean, so for example, in parts of Poplar and Limehouse, for example, where, you know, housing campaigns have reflected tenure segregation. I mean, if we look back at what was happening when the Canary Wharf estate was being developed, there was so much anxiety, quite rightly so, in terms of what, you know, driving out people from the local area, the gentrification, and various estates that, you know, have been redeveloped, and how that has changed the landscape and the area that we see now. But looking back, even just in the 90s, for example, I mean, when we had the BNP councillor elected on the Isle of Dogs, I mean, there was this, you know, housing was talked about as well, and it was talked about in a way which was, you know, that it's not benefiting white people in the area enough. And, you know, it's what I mentioned earlier in terms of the pitting of different working class communities against one another when there is a scarcity of resource. And we see this manifest itself in different ways, but there were at that time in that campaign quite, you know, really quite, you know, racial undertones, and sometimes really, of course, really blatant racism in relation to housing. And that, you know, in the same way we've seen in a national level in terms of, oh, you know, migrants coming here, taking our jobs, it was, and it has been, and there still are, you know, elements of, you know, migrants are taking our housing away, or it's bigger houses, and, you know, well, they get, you know, they're getting better quality. And actually, you know, we look at the figures and we all know that the figures show a very, very different picture, actually.
Thanks. Tanya?
I will just say that there's been a few developments in Southwark, which are the new builds, where, you know, developer-led new builds where there are some social rented housing and what have you, where the amenity space, specifically the garden, the communal garden, has not been for everybody. It's just been for the private owners. And I think that's quite normal. And, you know, I think it's also normal that there are different doors, the poor doors and so on. And the justification has always been that the service charge would be higher if the social rented tenants had the same kind of facilities as the private owners. But I think that argument's breaking down, and I've got to say largely due to the activities of organisations like Defend Council Housing in Haringey and other campaigners. I think there's a general question about democracy and, you know, who decides what housing should look like and who should be allowed in what parts of public space, what should be private. Those questions are really they really need to be asked when you talk about housing policy. And people, you know, people who live on council estates, people who'd like to live on council estates, private renters, we all need to be part of a conversation about what kind of housing we need. And at the moment, it's very top down. That's the problem. You know, if housing was democratically, you know, housing policy was democratically decided by the people who end up living in the housing, then I think we'd have a very different landscape.
I'm just going to use the last 10 minutes to try and focus on some positive, practical steps. Our friends from Black Lives Matter UK are saying, what can the movements on the ground in the UK do to help? We obviously, Homes for All has obviously already said, and likewise, I mean, I suppose the point is, what can we do to link up and amplify and build resistance? Somebody else has put the question, surely now's the time for a joined up national campaign that puts housing justice at the top of the agenda. So I'm going to put this to the panel, and can you give me short and sharp? I'm sorry, and thank you to everybody who's listening and watching. I'd love to be in a room with you all where we can flesh this out. But if you want to be part of this process, it would be great if you would sign up on the online form that's in the chat, so that we can keep in touch and maybe bring together everybody who's up for this to work out how we're going to act on the suggestions. But first, to the panel. Who wants to go first?
Well, I'll go first. I think that actually the Black Lives Matter movement has demonstrated some absolutely inspiring protests that actually have made change to certain institutions. We're having a lot more discussions. And I think it could be helpful if one of those institutions that need to examine what's going on is housing. You know, we need, both at the inquiry, the Grenfell inquiry, although we're not allowed in at the moment, we need our voices to be heard outside. And we could do with actually support on the ground in that sense. We could do with support if we call for support to protest outside our councils because of the decision making, you know. So in that way, if you can come together with the communities who are facing discriminations or fighting campaigns, that will be absolutely excellent, because we need, you know, we need your voice, we need your strength. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? What can we do to build resistance and a national movement? David, are you?
I'd just like to say, I think really we need to change the conversation about social housing and stop looking at it as something, as a problem, and stop looking at it as because that's allowed developers to come in and treat it as a way to make money, because they could just shunt the population somewhere else and sell the land. So, I mean, we need to look at building good houses for people, for everyone, and making sure they have a good quality standard of life. And that, I mean, that's something that all people need to be involved with, because all people need to press their muscles and for good quality social housing, because it makes such a difference to everyone's life. Because, I mean, crime and hotspots like that happen in cities because people have their opportunities taken away from them. And that's one of the things Black Lives Matter is talking about, is the fact that because people don't have opportunities, it is destroying the quality of life of black people all over. And this is something that I think we can all come together and talk about, as we really need to look at social housing and what cities are for, you know, because houses are the things you live in at the end of the day. They're not a commodity that buys you your pension or anything else, and they shouldn't be seen that way.
Thanks, David. Tanya, do you want to add anything? You're muted, I believe.
Sorry. I'd just echo what Moyra said about the way that the Black Lives Matter protests and demonstrations have been so inspiring, and you know, what can be achieved in a very short time when you've got a mass movement is quite amazing. And I think that we need to see our struggles as interlinked, and we need to see them as interdependent. And I think that we can all benefit from getting involved in the fight against racism, and we also have to understand how it's the same struggle, you know, so the struggle against 0 hours contracts, the struggle for PPE in the health service, the struggle for, you know, against police brutality, the struggle for decent housing. These are all struggles where working class people need to come together to use our collective power to bring change. And housing is very, very central to that. And we're based in communities as housing activists. And we need to get the message out to all our communities that when we fight together in a movement from below, we can change anything.
Brilliant. That is a very good note on which to end, but I'd like to float the idea that perhaps we could link up with Black Lives Matter and the tenants movement and our tenants with our banners on a day to be named, to demand justice for Grenfell and an end to racism in housing. Let's pick up that idea or something like it, and then maybe let's plan some coordinated action where we can all hold protests where we are, and have the confidence that comes from linking forces in order to shine a light where they don't want us to shine it. Okay, on that note, thanks to everybody, and if you are up for doing something, then please fill in the online form if you're not already in touch. We, as Homes for All, our next organising meeting is on the 25th of July at 11 AM. If you drop us a note, we'll send you the link to it. It'll be a Zoom meeting and everybody is welcome to get stuck into building this movement. Thanks to all our speakers. Thanks to Dave and Bookmarks for hosting us, and to Glyn for the backroom backup. Thanks a lot to Stand Up to Racism for live streaming the meeting so that we can reach out wider and unite. But most of all, thank you to all of you who are listening and taking part, because you are the force that helps to turn this into the movement that we need to challenge the power and win the justice we need. So thanks everybody, and thank you to our last speakers.